I was raised beneath chandeliers that never flickered, in a city where even the shadows wore perfume. In Lumen Court, my name, Selene Ashford, was a kind of currency, passed from mouth to mouth with the same careless delight as gossip in silk. I learned to walk without sound, to smile without meaning, to bow at exactly the angle that said I belonged. On the morning of my 17th spring, the Marquis announced a homecoming for his lost child, and the word struck the ballroom like a dropped goblet. The midwife arrived with a ledger wrapped in oilcloth, her hands trembling as if she carried a live coal. She did not look at me when she spoke. She looked at my mother, Lady Ashford, the woman who had braided my hair and called me daughter and said the swap had happened the night of the river flood, when lanterns drowned and infants wailed until dawn. The true-born girl was alive. She had been found, and I, the bright ornament of Ashford House, was an error that had learned to laugh. I remember the exact moment my mother's gaze shifted. Not to hatred, not yet, to calculation. By afternoon, my gowns were folded as if I were leaving for a holiday. By evening, my carriage rolled through the southern gate with only one maid, one trunk, and a sealed purse meant to buy my silence. The city's stones blurred behind me, and the countryside rose like an accusation. Willowford smelled of sap and smoke, of soil warmed by sun. The carriage stopped in front of a low timber house, and the driver's face said he wished to fling my trunk into the ditch and be done with it. I stepped down, the hem of my traveling skirt kissing dust, and for a breath I truly believed I might faint from the sheer insult of brown earth clinging to me. A girl with ink-dark eyes stood in the doorway, clutching a broom larger than her body. A boy the same age hovered behind her, half hidden, his gaze sharp in a way children's eyes rarely are. Their mother, my mother, by blood wiped her hands on her apron and tried to smile as if smiles could bridge 17 years. "Selene," she said, tasting the name like it was too fine for her tongue. "We've been waiting." I wanted to say, "You have been waiting for a different girl." Instead, I took in the cracked steps, the patched roof, the thin smoke curling from a clay chimney. My new father, broad-shouldered, palms scarred with honest work, was not there. He was in the fields. I was led inside, shown a small room with a cot and a window that framed nothing but beans, climbing sticks. The broom girl offered me a boiled egg with reverence, as if it were a jewel. Pride flared. Hunger flared hotter. I refused with the dignity of a duchess and the stomach of a starving cat. The first humiliation came quickly, as humiliations do when you step into a life that does not care who you used to be. I heard a rumor before I saw the man, that the neighbor's son was my childhood betrothed, promised in some dusty agreement when we were both still wrapped in swaddling cloth. I thought it might be my escape, a rope thrown across the gap between gutter and gallery. I found a wooden ladder leaning against the boundary wall and climbed it with the grace I'd been drilled into, ignoring the way the rungs pinched my palms. On the other side, a man stood bare-armed in the yard, splitting logs with a measured rhythm. He was taller than I expected, his hair tied back, his shoulders slick with sweat that caught the light like varnish. I cleared my throat as if I were calling a servant. "You," I said, and the word wobbled on the wind. "They say you are my promised husband. Is that true?" The axe paused midair. He turned slowly, as if he was choosing the speed of his contempt. His eyes were a clear, cold brown, the color of river stones. "I am promised," he answered, voice calm enough to sting, "but not to you." The pause after that sentence had teeth. "My betrothed is Maris Ashford." He said the name of the true-born girl as if it were a prayer and a curse at once. My face burned. Before I could craft an insult sharp enough to hide my shock, the ladder shivered. My foot slipped. I fell not elegantly, not even dramatically straight into the mud like a dropped sack of flour. Pain snapped through my ankle. I bit down on a scream and tasted blood. Then the chickens arrived. A flock of feathered demons swarmed, pecking at my skirt, my hair, my pride. The neighbors' children howled with laughter beyond the fence. Somewhere in the chaos, the log splitter set down his axe and watched with an expression that could have been amusement or pity, which was somehow worse. I would like to say that I endured my new life with saintly courage, but I did not. I sulked. I cursed. I stared at my clean hands and mourned their inevitable ruin. Yet the house did not collapse because I refused to love it. It continued, stubborn as weeds. My blood mother rose before dawn to knead dough and carry water. My blood father returned from the fields with his shirt plastered to his back, his breath rasping as if each inhale cost coin. The twins, Lena with the broom, Rowan with the sharp eyes, ran errands, fetched kindling, stole extra eggs from a neighbor's hen, and pretended it was magic. The first night I heard my new parents whispering in the room next to mine, their voices low. Grief threaded through every syllable. They spoke of Maris, the girl they had raised, the one who had left for Lumencourt with nothing but a sketchbook and a brave face. Lena cried softly, asking when her real sister would come back. Rowan said, fiercely, that we should march to the capital and trade me like a sack of grain. I lay awake in the dark, shame pooling under my ribs. I wanted to hate them for loving her. I could not. Their love was the only honest thing in the house. The next morning I pretended I had slept well and ordered myself not to cry. I failed. I cried anyway, into my sleeve, where no one could see the tear stains. When Lena found me, she did not laugh. She simply pressed the boiled egg into my palm again and said, "Eat, sister. You look like winter." I ate, because pride is easier to swallow when hunger is louder. Weeks passed. My ankle healed. My pride did not. But it learned to limp. I chose simpler clothes from my trunk, plain enough to avoid looking like a lunatic parading jewels among turnips. The silk parasols I had brought stupid. Beautiful things became shields against the merciless rural sun. When village children mocked us for walking under embroidered shade, I bribed them with sweets from my purse and recruited them as a marching entourage. They crowded beneath the parasols, wide-eyed, touching the tassels as if they expected wishes to fall out. My mother laughed that day. The sound startled out of her like a bird from grass. It hit me then. Laughter here was not decoration. It was survival. I began to watch how the household survived. We had too little wood, too few eggs, not enough oil for lamps. Every comfort was counted, every extra scrap folded into tomorrow. I stopped asking for hot water twice a day. I learned to braid my own hair without a maid tugging my scalp. I learned how to keep my face composed while my knees ached from scrubbing floors. In Lumencourt, effort was hidden behind servants' backs. In Willowford, effort was the only currency anyone trusted. I did not become humble in a single miraculous moment. I became practical, because reality is an uncompromising tutor. Elias Rowe, so I learned the log splitter's name, began to appear in small, infuriating ways. A bucket of water would be warm when I needed it, though no one admitted heating it. A smooth plank would replace a splintered one in my room, sanded until it shone, though my father claimed he had no time. A bundle of clean herbs would sit by my pillow after I'd coughed through the night, and Lena would swear she'd found it by accident. Elias rarely spoke to me directly. When he did, it was with a bluntness that felt almost disciplined. "Your shoes are wrong for mud," he said once, setting a pair of sturdy boots outside my door. "You will break your neck." I snapped that I would rather break my neck than wear peasant boots. The next day it rained, the path turned slick. I slipped, and he caught my elbow without a word. His grip was firm, his palm calloused. He let go immediately, as if touching me had burned him. That night, I sat by the small window and watched him through the fence as he studied by lamplight, scribbling numbers on scraps of paper like a man trying to translate the sky. For the first time, I wondered what kind of life could turn a scholar into a woodcutter. After the first month, I discovered a truth the palace never taught. Dignity is easier to keep when your stomach is full. I began to pay attention, not to what I had lost, but to what I could turn into leverage. Willowford's women wore the same two dresses until the seams surrendered. Their hair was tied for work, not beauty, and yet in their eyes I saw the same hunger I'd once fed with ribbons and compliments, hunger to be seen as more than hands. I started small. I traded one pearl pin for a basket of eggs. I traded 2 ribbons for a bolt of rough linen. At the market I sat beneath my ridiculous embroidered parasol and mended torn cuffs with stitches so neat the seam looked reborn. At first the villagers stared like I was a traveling oddity. Then one woman asked, shyly, if I could fix her wedding sash. I did, and I added a hidden stitch of red thread for luck, a custom from Lumencourt. The next week 3 more women came, and then 7, and then a farmer's daughter asked if I could show her how to braid her hair so it did not snag on her collar. When I taught her, her face lit as if I had given her a lantern. Coin began to clink in my palm, small, hard, honest coin earned by skill rather than inheritance. I hid it in a clay jar beneath the floorboard, because pride may die slowly, but caution can be learned in a season. Rowan watched me count it one night and said, "So you really can make money without yelling at people?" I flicked his forehead. "I can make money while yelling at people," I corrected, and Lena laughed so hard she nearly toppled into the flour. With the first jarful, I bought slate boards and chalk and paid a tired priest to teach the twins their letters twice a week. Lena traced her own name as if it were magic. Rowan wrote mine with fierce concentration and then, to my shock, added "sister" beside it. I pretended not to notice my throat tightening. The rumors, of course, arrived as soon as success did. A neighbor muttered that I was bewitching men with city tricks. Another claimed I had seduced Elias and stolen his attention from the real bride. I met their looks with a smile that promised consequences. The next market day I set up my stall beside the carpenter's booth where my father sold stools and cabinet doors, and I offered, for free, repairs to any child's shoes whose soles were splitting. By noon, every mother in Willowford had decided I was either useful or harmless, and the latter opinion is safer to hold. Elias came once, late, when most people had gone. He set a thin book on my table, an arithmetic primer, its pages worn soft. "For Rowan," he said. Then, after a pause, "For you too, if you want. Do you think I cannot count?" I asked, offended on principle. Elias's eyes warmed with the faintest humor. "I think you count everything," he replied, "but you do it in ways that will not feed your family forever." His bluntness should have irritated me. Instead, it steadied me. That night, by lamplight, he showed Rowan how to add columns of numbers, and he showed me how to read a ledger without letting it read me back. When the twins fell asleep at the table, their heads touching like matched seeds, Elias and I carried them to bed together. In the narrow hallway, our shoulders brushed, and a current ran through me that had nothing to do with weather. "Selene," he said softly, as if he had been holding the name in his mouth for weeks. I did not answer. Some silence is not emptiness. It is a door you stand before until you decide whether you dare to open it. The answer arrived wrapped in fear. One evening my blood mother entered my room with red eyes and a smile too tight to be real. "We've made a plan," she whispered, as if plans were prayers. "We'll sell 2 plots of land. We'll pay for Elias to return to his studies. He'll pass the civil exams. He'll rise. He will keep you safe." The words should have comforted me, but my stomach went cold. Safety purchased with sacrifice tastes like ash. I listened harder and noticed what was missing. The twins' usual soft snoring from the next room, Lena's habit of talking in her sleep, Rowan's occasional muttered complaints. I sat up so fast the world spun. "Where are they?" I demanded. My mother broke. The truth spilled out between sobs. My father had taken Lena and Rowan to the town magistrate's estate. A 10-year indenture, food and clothing guaranteed, wages promised. "It is a good life," my mother said, and her voice shattered on the lie. Everyone in Willowford knew Magistrate Calder's appetites. Everyone had heard the stories of girls disappearing into the estate's back rooms and returning with eyes that never met sunlight again. My breath came in ragged pieces. In the capital, men like Calder were called rough and spirited, and given invitations. Here, he was simply a predator with papers. I did not ask permission. I did not ask forgiveness. I walked out into the night and found Elias harnessing his mare, already preparing to go, his jaw set with the kind of resolve that makes men dangerous. "Do not beg, Calder," I told him, "because pleading at a man's feet always leaves bruises. Do not ask favors from your old teachers. Calder will break your future for sport." Elias's gaze flicked over me, measuring. "Then what do you suggest?" he asked, and the question had an edge. What can a fallen girl offer besides tears? I touched the only luxury I had not hidden, the jade bracelet on my wrist. A pale green circle that had once been paraded at court. "We will remind him who I used to be," I said, "not because he deserves respect, but because fear is a language he understands." We borrowed a fine carriage from a merchant who owed my father kindness. We hired 2 strong men with hard faces and harder fists. At dawn we arrived at Calder's gate with wheels loud enough to announce trouble. The steward opened the door with a smirk that died as my boots hit the stone. I had dressed as I once did, hair pinned with a pearl comb, cloak lined in dark velvet, chin lifted so high it could have sliced wind. I did not wait to be invited. I walked into the hall as if it belonged to me. Magistrate Calder appeared in silk and arrogance, eyes immediately crawling over me like ants. Before he could speak, I let my voice turn cold, the way my mother's voice used to sound when a servant had spilled wine on her favorite gown. "I hear you have detained my family," I said, "and I hear you have entertained a certain fantasy about purchasing me." The words landed like a slap. Calder's face flashed, then smoothed into calculation as his gaze snagged on the bracelet. "Ashford," he murmured, tasting the name. So the rumors are true. I smiled without warmth. Rumors are cheaper than consequences, I replied. Release the children. Release my father. Or I will take my story back to Lumen Court and let the Chancellor decide whether you are a magistrate or a thief. Calder hesitated. Men like him are brave only when no one is watching. I gave him no space to feel brave. Elias stepped forward then, silent and looming, his presence a shadow that promised violence without needing to brandish it. Calder's pride fought his fear. Fear won. We left with Lena and Rowan on the carriage floor, trembling, and with a purse of apology coin tossed after us by a steward who would rather pay than bleed. My mother cried into her apron. My father stared at me as if I had grown fangs. I was shaking too, though I hid it by tightening my grip on the reins until my knuckles paled. Back in Willowford, I sat under the eaves and listened to the twins recount every detail of the magistrate's estate. The locked rooms, the way servants avoided eye contact, the smell of expensive incense trying to cover rot. That night I could not sleep. The village had returned the children, but it would not forget the idea of selling them. Poverty teaches desperation. Desperation is a knife that turns inward. I stared at my purse of capital money and realized the truth I had been avoiding. Coin can rescue you from one cliff, but it does not teach you how to stop walking toward the next one. If I wanted my blood family safe, I needed more than bribes. I needed leverage. I needed answers. And somewhere in Lumen Court, Maris Ashford, the true-born girl, was alone in the house I used to call home, surrounded by people who resented her existence. I remembered Calder's offhand mention of rumors, that Maris had been mocked, confined, stripped of a prestigious betrothal. That did not sound like the gentle justice my mother would have offered. Something in the capital had shifted while I was learning to light fires with damp wood. I decided I would go back. Elias insisted on coming. If you walk into Lumen Court alone, you will be eaten, he said. And I could not deny the accuracy even as it offended me. We left before dawn, with Lena and Rowan clutching my hands so tightly my fingers went numb. My blood mother pressed a small cloth bundle into my lap, dried fruit, a ribbon I did not remember owning, a note with shaky handwriting that said only, "Come home alive." On the road, the sky split open with rain. By the second day, my throat burned. By the third, fever dragged my thoughts through mud thicker than any chicken yard. Elias found an inn with a roof that mostly held, carried me inside without asking, and argued with the keeper until we were given the cleanest room available. "It is still filthy," I croaked. Elias stripped the bed, beat the dust out of the blanket, wiped the frame with boiled water and a rag, then laid his own cloak down like a sacrificial offering. When the innkeeper's wife called me his wife with a grin, I lacked the strength to correct her, which was somehow more humiliating than my fever. In the night, half delirious, I told Elias everything I had never dared say, that I missed marble floors, that I hated the smell of mud in my hair, that I was tired of pretending I did not care about comfort when my bones ached for it. My confession came out ugly, selfish, honest. Elias listened without flinching. When my voice broke, he offered me sugared fruit, as if sweetness could patch a cracked soul. On the fourth night, when my fever lowered enough for thoughts to take shape, I asked the question that had been needling me since the day I fell from his ladder. "Whose betrothed are you?" I said, staring at the ceiling to avoid the heat in his eyes. Elias's silence stretched. Then he sat on the edge of the bed and spoke quietly, each word set down like a stone on a grave. "I was promised to Maris," he admitted. "It was arranged when the Ashfords believed she lived in Willowford. They promised their daughter to my mother in exchange for a debt paid in blood." I frowned. "In blood?" His jaw tightened. My mother was Captain Rowan Rowe, the woman they called the Grey Comet on the western border. She rode with the king's banner, won battles men wrote poems about, and then vanished the year the palace burned. I had heard the legend every child in Lumen Court had. The fearless commander who refused a lord's hand, who faced down a warlord and laughed, who died in a fire that took half the court with it. "She didn't die," Elias said, reading the disbelief on my face. She hid. She hid because she carried the one secret the palace would kill for." He opened his fist and showed me a ring I had never seen, a plain band carved inside with the crest of the royal house. "My father is not the man in the village cemetery," he said. "My father is a throne." The room seemed to tilt. I understood then why his scholarship had stalled, why creditors had hounded him, why his name felt familiar in a way I could not place. Elias had been living as a woodcutter because living as anything else might have gotten him murdered. Lumencourt greeted us with the city's favorite sport, pretending nothing had changed while measuring exactly how much had. The guards at the gate stared too long at my face, recognition flickering, and I almost laughed at the absurdity. I had lost my title, my mother, my house, yet my cheekbones still unlocked doors. Word traveled faster than carriages. By the time we reached the outer district, a man in blue and silver livery rode up, his horse foaming, and announced that Duke Valen's heir was searching for me. My childhood was suddenly in front of me in the shape of Adrian Valen, tall, handsome, too polished to belong to any life but court. He slid off his horse and looked at me as if he were seeing a ghost he had once wanted to marry. "Celine," he breathed, and his voice held regret like a bruise. "I thought you were gone." Behind him stood a carriage with the ducal crest. I expected comfort. Instead, I smelled a trap, because comfort in Lumencourt always costs something. Adrian begged me to return with him to the Valen estate, until things were settled. He spoke as if my life were paperwork. I agreed anyway, because refusing would have been pride, and pride does not feed families. Elias's shoulders went rigid beside me. The servants looked him over with quiet contempt, as if poverty were contagious. I introduced him as my escort and watched their faces flatten into false politeness. It pleased me more than it should have. The Duchess Valen met me in a room filled with lilies and judgment. She did not rise. Her eyes scanned my clothes, my hands, the faint scar on my ankle from my fall, and I felt like a horse being priced. "You were raised well," she said finally, and the compliment sounded like an insult. "It is unfortunate about your birth." I smiled, sweet as poisoned honey. "It is unfortunate about many things," I replied, and let the implication hang. The Duchess's mouth tightened. She offered me gifts with the same smile she would use to offer alms. Jewelry, bolts of cloth, a purse heavy enough to bruise. "Consider it a kindness," she said, "and consider it wise to distance yourself from my son." Adrian looked at the carpet, caught between duty and desire, and I realized with a sharp pang that he had always been this way. Gentle, indecisive, easier to love in poetry than in real life. I accepted the gifts because refusing would have been foolish. I planned to turn her bribes into land for Willowford. That night, in the servants' corridor, my old maid Yvette found me. She had been dismissed from Ashford House after I left, and had clawed her way into Valen's service by sheer loyalty. She fell to her knees and called me, "My lady," before catching herself, eyes filling. "Maris is being punished for your face," she whispered. "Lady Ashford has her kept in the north wing. The other daughters mock her. They say she's a peasant dressed in borrowed lace." My throat tightened. "My mother," I said, and the words sounded foreign. "Why would she do that?" Yvette shook her head. "Something frightens her. There are men visiting the Marquess at night. There are letters burned in the hearth." I thought of Magistrate Calder and his fear of the Chancellor. I thought of Elias's ring. Lumencourt was not a stage. It was a chessboard. I went to Ashford House at dawn. Not through the front gate where pride would be on display, but through the side garden I knew by heart, past the fountain where I had once tossed coins for wishes I did not deserve. The rose trellis had been trimmed into a new shape, as if my absence had allowed the gardeners to breathe. A kitchen boy recognized me and dropped a tray of bread. His eyes widened with terror and awe. I slipped him a coin and asked where Maris was kept. He pointed toward the coldest part of the estate. The north wing smelled of damp stone. A single maid guarded the door to Maris's rooms, sleepy and bored. She did not expect an intruder who wore confidence like armor. "Move," I said, not loudly, but with the exact tone that used to make grown men obey. She moved. Inside, Maris Ashford sat by a window with a sketchbook on her lap, her hair braided plainly, her dress neat, but too simple for a Marquess's daughter. She looked up, and for a moment we stared at each other as if mirrors had learned to hate. She was not my twin. She was softer around the mouth, sharper around the eyes. There was a stubbornness in her posture that I recognized from myself, though I had never earned it the way she had. "So you're the one who wore my name," she said, and her voice did not tremble. "And you're the one who survived my life," I answered. And the words surprised us both. Maris's gaze flicked over my hands, noticed the faint calluses I had tried to file away, the small bruise on my knuckle. "You went to the village," she said quietly. "How was it?" I could have lied. Instead, I said, hard enough that it made me honest. Maris's mouth twitched, almost a smile. "We spoke for an hour like enemies forced to share a battlefield." She told me of humiliation, of false friends, of my former sisters treating her as a stain. I told her of chickens and mud, of the twins' terror, of a magistrate's greed. When I mentioned Elias, her eyes softened in a way that twisted my stomach. He was kind to me, she admitted, before I left. The truth settled between us. We were both being used, swapped like pieces in a game neither of us had chosen. We found the first thread of the plot not in a grand council chamber, but in the seam of an old doll. Yvette brought it to me that evening, hands shaking. Lady Ashford ordered the nursery cleared. She whispered. They were going to burn everything. Hidden inside the doll's stitched belly was a folded paper, browned with age. Ink faded but legible. A record of payments made the night of the flood. The midwife's name. A second name beneath it. Chancellor Marrow. I felt the room go colder. Marrow was the king's right hand, a man whose smile never reached his eyes. If he had financed the swap, then the swap was not an accident. It was a strategy. I showed the paper to Elias in the stable yard, away from curious servants. He read it and went still. My mother warned me about Marrow, he murmured. She said he hunts secrets like foxes hunt rabbits. I thought of my own mother's new coldness, her whispered night meetings, her burned letters. Perhaps she was not cruel. Perhaps she was cornered. We needed proof strong enough to crack stone. Elias proposed something reckless. Infiltrate Marrow's townhouse and steal the ledger that would tie him to the midwife, the swap, and whatever he had tried to hide. Reckless plans are the only plans that work when the enemy has the law. We moved that night like thieves who had once been children. I knew the rhythm of noble houses, the guard changes, the sleepy servants, the arrogance that makes men believe their doors cannot be opened. Elias moved like someone accustomed to darkness. Inside Marrow's townhouse, the air smelled of ink and power. We found the ledger in a hidden cabinet behind a painting of the king, as if Marrow wanted to keep his secrets literally behind the crown. The pages were filled with transactions, coded names, dates that made my pulse race. There it was. Payment to the midwife, payment to a river boatman, payment to a seamstress who had embroidered the wrong crest onto the wrong blanket. And there, in a different ink, a note that made me grip the page until it crumpled. Ensure the commander's child is removed from court. Ensure the heir remains uncontested. I looked at Elias. His face was pale. He tried to erase you, I whispered. He tried to erase your mother. Elias's eyes burned, but his voice stayed steady. He tried, he corrected. We did not have time to celebrate. Footsteps sounded downstairs. Men's voices, sharp and sober. Marrow was not the kind of man who slept early. Elias tucked the ledger beneath his cloak. We slipped through a window into the night garden and ran until our lungs felt torn. Back at Vallon Estate, I hid the ledger inside the lining of my traveling trunk, the same trunk that had once carried my gowns out of Ashford House like a coffin. Then I sat on the floor and laughed once quiet, disbelieving because the world had twisted into something so grand and vicious that my earlier sorrows seemed almost quaint. The Chancellor struck first, because predators always do when they sense prey gaining teeth. A royal banquet was announced with too much fanfare, too many invitations. It was to celebrate unity, which in Lumencourt always meant submission. Adrian begged me to attend, voice tight. Marrow has asked about you, he said. He says he wants to set things right. I imagined Marrow's smile, knives hidden behind it. He wants to set me somewhere. I corrected. I attended anyway. Because this is the only way to defeat a trap is to see its teeth. The palace glittered, gold and glass and carefully arranged cruelty. Maris arrived with Lady Ashford at her shoulder like a prisoner escorted by a jailer. When our eyes met across the hall, Maris lifted her chin, and I felt a surge of pride that did not belong solely to myself. The king sat on the dais, face unreadable. Chancellor Marrow stood close to him, whispering. When Marrow's gaze landed on me, he smiled as if we shared a joke. He approached with measured steps and offered his hand. Lady Celine, he purred. Or should I say, Willowford Cellini, how charming that you've returned. His voice carried just enough to invite nearby ears. I hear your new family struggled, he continued. I admire a girl who knows her place. My pulse hammered. I smiled back, bright and deadly. My place, I said, is wherever I choose to stand. Marrow's eyes narrowed a fraction. Perhaps, he said, you would choose to stand under protection. Magistrate Calder has been promoted for his loyalty. He is seeking a refined wife to guide his household. The implication slid across the floor like oil. A lesser girl might have choked. I let my laugh ring. How generous, I said. I will consider it after I consult the Dowager Queen. Merrow's smile froze. The Dowager Queen was the only person in the palace who had ever made him bow without flinching. I did not actually have access to the Dowager Queen. Not yet. But Elias did. Hidden beneath his calm was a map of alliances drawn in blood. While Merrow busied himself weaving offers that were really chains, Elias moved through the crowd and vanished toward the inner corridors. I drew attention. As planned, I danced with Adrian under chandeliers, let court ladies whisper about my audacity, let men stare as if beauty were permission. Every gaze was a thread pulling away from where Elias needed to go. When Merrow returned, his smile had sharpened. It seems, he said softly, you have forgotten that you are not protected by the Ashford name anymore. I leaned in as if sharing flirtation. It seems, I murmured back, you have forgotten what a ledger can do. Merrow's pupils tightened. Before he could respond, a trumpet sounded. The Dowager Queen entered the hall, slower than youth but weighted with authority. She wore black velvet and a crown that did not sparkle so much as threaten. On her arm walked Elias. The entire room inhaled and held it. Elias bowed to the king with precision, then raised his head and let the light catch the signet ring on his finger. The crest of the royal house glinted like a blade. Murmurs rippled. Merrow's face drained. The Dowager Queen spoke, and her voice carried the kind of power that doesn't need volume. Chancellor Merrow, she said, you have been busy. She gestured, and palace guards moved not toward Elias, but toward Merrow. I stepped forward then, heart pounding, and held up the ledger in both hands. I have evidence, I announced, and for once the hall's attention felt like a weapon in my grip. Evidence of an arranged infant swap, financed by the Chancellor, intended to remove a child of royal blood from court. The words fell into silence heavy as stone. The king's expression cracked, not into anger, but into disbelief that someone had dared to drag secrets into daylight. Maris, standing beside Lady Ashford, went pale. Lady Ashford's hand trembled on her fan. She looked at me, and in her eyes I saw not cruelty but fear. Fear of Merrow, fear of what he could do, fear of what she had tolerated to keep the rest of us alive. Merrow tried to laugh. Slander, he snapped, but his voice betrayed him. The Dowager Queen's gaze was colder. If it is slander, she said, then you will welcome an inquiry. Merrow took a step back, and that single, instinctive retreat told the room everything it needed. Guards seized him. He shouted about loyalty, about the king's safety, about traitors and peasants. Elias spoke then, and his voice was low, but carried like a drawn bow. My mother saved this kingdom, he said. You repaid her by hunting her son. Merrow's eyes flashed with hatred. You were never meant to exist, he spat. Elias's smile was thin. And yet, he replied, here I am. The hall erupted into controlled chaos, ministers whispering, nobles gasping, servants scurrying like startled mice. Adrian moved toward me, hand outstretched, but I stepped away. I was not his problem to solve. I was my own storm. I crossed to Maris and took her hand in full view of the court. Her fingers were cold. You didn't ask for this, I said quietly. Maris blinked fast, fighting tears. Neither did you, she answered. Lady Ashford watched us, her composure finally cracking. I tried, she whispered, voice swallowed by the noise. I tried to keep you both safe. I believed her, and the belief hurt. Sometimes the people who love you fail not from malice, but from fear. Fear is still failure, but it is easier to forgive. Merrow's arrest did not end the danger. It simply changed its shape. 3 nights after the banquet, a servant girl slipped into my borrowed chamber at Duke Velen's estate and pressed a folded note into my hand. Her lips were white. They told me to leave this under your cup, she whispered. I saw the powder. My fingers tightened around the paper. It was unsigned, but the message was clear. Leave the capital by sunrise, or the next drink will not make you merely ill. I showed Adrian and watched his face go tight with fury. He wanted to storm the palace, to demand answers from men who would smile and lie and call it policy. Elias stopped him with a single sentence. Merrow had apprentices. That was how power survived seeds scattered in every office, every guard post, every kitchen. We could not burn the entire garden in one night. We could only uproot the worst weed and then keep our boots ready for the next. The Dowager Queen moved faster than grief. She summoned the palace guard captain and ordered an audit of every servant assignment that had changed in the last decade. When the captain balked, she made him kneel and recite the oaths he had sworn. Her authority was not loud, but it was absolute. Still, Marrow's allies were desperate, and desperate men choose spectacular ways to fail. The next morning, as I crossed a courtyard toward Ashford House to see Maris, an arrow hissed from a roofline. Elias caught me by the waist and yanked me behind a stone pillar. The arrow struck the wall and quivered like an accusation. Adrian drew his sword, but he was too far from the shooter, too slow to see the second arrow that was meant for my throat. Elias threw his arm up, and the shaft bit into his sleeve, slicing skin. He did not even flinch. He simply ran, dragging me through a servant passage that smelled of damp mortar and old secrets. We emerged near the palace stables where the dowager's personal guards waited, faces grim. Her Majesty anticipated this, their leader said, as if being hunted were a routine inconvenience. My hands shook when I saw blood darkening Elias's cuff. I pressed my fingers to the cut. "You bleed like everyone else," I muttered, trying to make a joke so I would not start screaming. Elias's mouth twitched. "I have never claimed to be immortal," he said, and in the middle of terror the absurd tenderness of that reply nearly broke me. The assassin was caught within the hour. A young guard with fear in his eyes, and Marrow's seal hidden in his boot. Under questioning, he confessed to being paid by a man who promised him promotion and protection. Protection from what? From debt, from shame, from hunger. The same old chains, polished and sold as opportunity. The Dowager Queen listened, expression unreadable, and then ordered the man imprisoned rather than executed. "Dead men do not lead us to living snakes," she said. By afternoon, whispers spread that the fallen Ashford girl had survived a palace attack, and suddenly I was no longer simply a scandal. I was a symbol, and symbols are harder to dispose of quietly. Marrow had built his trap to close in the dark. The Dowager forced it into daylight, where every blade looked uglier. The weeks after the banquet were a storm of investigations and shifting loyalties. Chancellor Marrow was imprisoned pending trial. Magistrate Calder's promotion was revoked, and he fled before he could be arrested, leaving behind an estate full of locked doors and frightened servants. The king avoided public appearances, his authority bruised by the revelation that his own court had been rearranging infants like chess pieces. The Dowager Queen became the real axis of the palace, issuing decrees with a steadiness that made even the proudest dukes nod. Elias refused titles, refused gifts, refused the seductive comfort of becoming what Marrow had feared. "I will not be bait," he told the Dowager Queen, and she studied him with an old warrior's eyes and then laughed softly, as if pleased to see a spine where she expected a ribbon. I returned to Willowford once the roads were safe, not with a single trunk and a sealed purse, but with contracts, coin earned in truth, and a plan that did not rely on anyone's pity. Lena and Rowan ran to meet me, taller than before, their faces bright. My bloodfather hugged me with awkward strength. My blood mother cried and did not hide it. I used the Duchess's kindness to buy back the land my parents had nearly sold, and more besides. I hired a teacher from town to instruct village children, not only my siblings but any child whose parents would allow it. "Letters are a kind of lockpick," I told Lena, and she grinned as if she understood exactly what I meant. Maris visited Willowford in autumn, arriving not in a gilded carriage but in a plain cart, her sketchbook under her arm. The villagers stared as if a legend had walked into their mud, because to them she was the real daughter who had escaped. She knelt by the river and drew the reeds, the weathered hands of farmers, the crooked smile of a boy missing a tooth. She looked at my blood mother with quiet tenderness and said, "Thank you for raising me." And my mother wept so hard she had to sit down. Watching them, I understood that family is sometimes not a question of blood but of time, and time is the most expensive gift anyone gives. In the evenings, Maris and I sat under the same roof and spoke as sisters might. Cautiously at first, then with growing ease. We did not pretend to be the same. We did not need to. We had been forged in different fires, and that difference was not a weapon. It was a bridge. Elias came to Willowford last, slipping into the village like a man who belonged to quiet places, though the world now knew his name. He stood at the edge of the fields where my father's shoulders had bent for years and said, "This is where I want to live." I stared at him, suspicious. "You're a problem," I told him, because truth spoken plainly is sometimes safer than affection. Elias's mouth curved. "I have always been a problem," he agreed. "I would like to be your problem, if you'll allow it." The audacity of the request made my chest tighten. In Lumencourt, marriage was a contract. In Willowford, it was partnership carved from survival. I had been promised away twice, once to a duke's heir, once to a scholar who was never mine. For the first time, I wanted to choose. I walked him to the boundary wall where I had once climbed a ladder and fallen into disgrace. The ladder was still there, weathered, steady. I set my hand on the wood and said, "If you ever tell anyone about the chickens, I will poison your tea." Elias's laughter was quiet and real. "Then I will guard my tongue," he said, "with my life." I reached up, stood on the first rung, and kissed him before pride could interfere. The village wind tasted of smoke and sunlight. I did not miss chandeliers in that moment. In the end, the capital tried to offer me my old life back, trimmed and polished for public consumption. Lady Ashford sent letters full of careful tenderness, invitations to return, apologies that sounded like prayer. Adrian sent one letter, short and sincere, admitting he had loved the idea of me more than he had loved the actual girl. I forgave him, because bitterness would have chained me to a past that had already discarded me. The Dowager Queen offered me a minor title and a stipend. I accepted the stipend and refused the title. "I would rather build something real," I told her. She studied me for a long moment, and then nodded, as if recognizing a fellow builder of uncomfortable truths. When winter came, Willowford's fields lay fallow beneath frost, and our new schoolhouse glowed with lamplight and children's stubborn voices learning letters. Lena wrote her name for the first time and looked at me as if she had